Hi everyone, it's David Thompson again with the Civil War Monitor's Behind the Lines interview series. And today I'm joined by Jim Downs, the Assistant Professor of History and American Studies at College, or Connecticut College for those of you not from New England. And he is the author of the most recent book, Sick from Freedom, African American Illness and Suffering During the Civil War and Reconstruction. It's out with Oxford University Press. And Jim, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So if you could just start us off, perhaps giving us a little bit of a sense of what this book really is about, because it is unlike anything that people will have read.
Right. So the major argument of the book is that I'm very interested in examining the ways in which a number of emancipated slaves did not survive freedom. And so what I sort of argue is that resulted from a number of factors. First, it results from the fact that the Civil War was the largest biological catastrophe of the 19th century, where more soldiers died from illness than from battle. So that freed slaves ran from southern plantations to a war where they were in an environment plagued by disease and sickness. So that's part of why they started becoming sick and suffering during this period. The second, and this is the point that I'm most interested in, is the extent to which dislocation, which accompanied the emancipation, actually generated illness and sickness during this period. One of the sort of national mythologies that we have about the Civil War, and particularly about emancipation, is that we sort of imagine slaves dancing in jubilee at the moment of freedom, and it's true. But the question is, what happened 2-3 hours later, 2-3 days later, weeks later? And what my book is trying to do is to sort of show the extent to which that dislocation led to the outbreak of illness and disease. And then there are a number of other factors that the book outlines, everything from the 19th century uncertainty with the spread of illness to the fact that to the fact that the environment of itself was as Megan Kate Nelson and others have described, ruined at this point, which also exacerbated the spread of illness.
Yeah, and I'd be interested if you could just continue a little bit of talking. That this idea of movement is obviously very prominent in your work. There's a few other works that have been coming out as of late discussing this idea in kind of different variations. Do you think this is a new thread of investigation for the war as we are moving 150 years later?
Right, I hope so. I mean, I think that one of the things, Yael Sternheld talks about this a little bit, and it's her main point of her book, and she has a section on emancipated slaves, but her book, I think, is really useful to get us to think about the extent to which there's all of this different kinds of traffic that are happening during the war. And I think that Civil War historians have traditionally been focused on the particular plot of battles. And what Sternheld's work is sort of getting us to think about is the extent to which soldiers arrived at those battle scenes, in which there was a massive movement of soldiers. I would add to that there's a massive movement of freed slaves. We often used to think of freed slaves for political purposes, that movement connotated early forms of liberation and freedom, and it does that. But it also raises a number of other questions of where are they going to go, and what's at stake in all of this movement, especially when one considers public health. And then, of course, the area that remains really underexplored and under-theorized are the movement of civilians, the movement of displaced Southerners, white Southerners, who appear sporadically throughout the Freedmen's Bureau records, but often sort of fall to the margins. And then, of course, what needs to be understood, and there's work that touches on these people, but the extent to which their movement is also central to the development, there are the number of northern benevolent reformers who travel from the north to the south. And so what you're seeing is an enormous amount of migratory patterns that are sometimes interacting with each other, don't necessarily lead to sort of happy endings, and they often raise sort of different questions. And in my own work, it raises questions about health. I mean, what does it mean to travel that far? What does it mean not to have shelter? Where does one get food? Where does one get any type of support that you would need on that type of journey?
Obviously, the source space for this was not something that is easily come by. And you speak to this a little bit, obviously, with even in the acknowledgments, but also the introduction, talking about some of the struggles that you encountered. I wonder if you could speak to, the difficulty of that, but also trying to, as I think you mentioned in the book, trying to kind of read into some of these sources where the voice of the free people is gone. It's not there, so you need to read into it yourself.
Yeah. So I think there's two pieces. I think one is that I approached this project, I began this project in the late 20th century, and I sort of had ideas about race and medicine, about this sort of ways in which medical thinkers, scientists, physicians, the public at large wrote quite copiously about black people and about black health. But when I started to really dig around the archives in the 19th century archive, I recognized that that was more of a product of the early 20th century. That came out of the eugenics movement. And that came out of a lot of other sort of intellectual currents that were happening in large part in the early part of the 20th century, because in many respects, political figures, intellectuals were in search of a scientific argument to marshal. I mean, they were in search of a sort of scientific evidence to sort of marshal a political argument about segregation. So they needed to sort of buttress that with these sort of copious, illustrative sort of comments about the differences between black and white bodies. That doesn't happen so much in the 19th century. So the question becomes, does it not happen because it's so much part of just the general thinking and understandings about the body and about race that it doesn't need to be articulated? It's a question I really wasn't able to sort of answer. And so in the records of the 19th century Freedmen's Bureau, and even throughout the medical records, there are, of course, the examples that everybody knows, where Josiah Nott and other people talk about the differences of the black body. But again, these are few and far between. So it was really hard just to begin to find moments when people would articulate this. And what would be at stake in order for white physicians, the white medical community, everyday, ordinary Americans to. So when you raise that question, it then naturally leads to the question of freed people's voices. And one of the things that's happened ever since the sort of founding of the Freed People in Southern Society project in 1976 was that it produced a voluminous, almost infinite number of black voices. When and where those voices enter, to sort of connote Paula Giddings, you realize that they enter at very specific moments. They affidavits. They enter when freed people are asking for education, for schools. They enter when freed people can sign contracts. So freed people's voices are heard throughout the 19th century archive, but they're heard. There wasn't, as far as I can see, any type of administrative or bureaucratic federal system of accounting that would capture freed people's voices during the 19th century in terms of their health. The only place that you get a sort of unencumbered narrative of black people's health, as articulated by freed people themselves, is in the pension records. Those records, again, are sort of they're a complicated set of records because they're only for those who served in the military and their families. So, but you get a detailed accounting of freed people's illnesses, and I treat that particular section in chapter 5 of the book.
This is obviously it's a tremendous project because I mean you're looking at the darker side of emancipation, and obviously you're the first person who's tackling this.
Right.
As you mentioned with the Freedmen's Project, I'm thinking of people like Barbara Fields and Ira Berlin. You're talking about the agency of the slave.
Right.
But there's a great line in your book. You said, if a slave had smallpox, how and they can't get out of bed, how can they have agency?
Right.
Is this something that you are just very fortunate and you came across it through a lot of hard work, or do you think this is something that historians have really been uncomfortable with trying to grapple with up to this point in time, and now it's a sesquicentennial that we're actually comfortable trying to look at it?
Right. So, I mean, there are so many different questions to that. So first, to just sort of a clarification, just to be, I very early on in my graduate career, I had the good fortune to work with Barbara Fields, and so she's someone who really got me to question whether question this notion of agency. And she would never sort of put herself into a category where she was arguing for black agency. In fact, she would be really suspicious of that. And so that type of criticism that I sort of learned from her at a very early age, a very early academic age, made me sort of think about how I would read the voices and the experience of freed people in the early in the early part of Reconstruction. I guess I would say this. I mean, I think that her comments are instructive because they sort of preceded Walter Johnson and other people who actually started questioning the agency debate. And I think that the book had an auspicious debut in that it sort of happens right at the moment where people are sort of rethinking what this notion of agency is. I mean, Johnson thinks his own notions of agency in the Journal of Social History after he puts forth this really polemical but quite provocative and quite cogent argument in Soul by Soul. So I think it coincides with all of these things. I remember working on the project and sitting at the University of Mississippi at a conference with Carol Emberton, who is a historian at the University of Buffalo, and having that very conversation about freed people and smallpox. And it was in conversations with other scholars like Emberton, who's working on a really brilliant forthcoming book on violence. And she and I were just talking, and we got to the point where we realized that, this notion of agency is really romantic. And that it's problematic in a lot of ways. And so what I'm trying to sort of do here and sort of mentioning these other people is to say that it comes out. Sorry, this is New York. And
it's all right.
I live in the middle of where there's fire trucks, so I apologize. So anyway, it gives you local color. So the point is, what I'm trying to get at is that I don't want to take total full responsibility for this. I think that I was having conversations with other people. I was being trained in a particular way. There was an intellectual current that was developing that was more suspicious of it. And I think that allowed me to sort of make the claims that I made in the book. And when I finished the book and I wrote the conclusion, I actually began to sort of see a sense of agency that I didn't see when I first started the project. And it was largely about this question of voices. I started realizing, why did military officials even begin to sort of take notice? And then I realized it was because freed people began reporting on their illnesses and began talking to these officials. But the sort of nature of the record was such that the military official didn't need to say that he saw that he had a conversation with a freed person. He would just be able to sort of write, "We need blankets." And the same with the benevolent worker. They wouldn't need to explain how they learned about the high mortalities among freed slaves. They could just report it. And so I began to notice that there was an agency there. There was an undercurrent, but it was an inarticulate discourse that percolated. There was something that was happening on the ground that wasn't getting captured in the record.
So where do we go now with public health, emancipated slaves? This is just the surface. Where would you like to see it going?
Well, I mean, I would like to see it going in a lot of different places. I mean, I feel like I just scratched the surface in so many ways, and I think there can be more epidemiological analyses of the different kinds of diseases that happen. I mean, I'm interested in working on a future book on cholera, but there's so much more to be done on yellow fever. There's so much more to be done on dysentery. There's so much more to be done, which I didn't do, which is the extent to which in the 1870s, right after the Reconstruction governments take over, they hand over support to to local authorities. And that work, those local public health authorities throughout the 19th century, that hasn't been documented. I also feel really excited by the work being done by Lisa Brady, by Megan Kate Nelson, by other historians of the environment. And I think that historians of public health don't need to be so strict in their sort of analysis, that they should actually be sort of working with those historians. So I see like a new generation of interpretation that intersects with these other fields. I'm also really interested in just the question of Reconstruction in terms of what does Reconstruction look like when we don't think about politics? And of course, that sounds like a ridiculous question to ask because it's a period all about politics. But that can help us shift our focus to other types of questions and other types of issues. The problems with the Freedmen's Bureau records, and they're an important and critical resource that we as historians have depended on for the last generation. But they've also set the standards on what we should study and what we shouldn't study. And so they've set the parameters on the years of Reconstruction. They set the sort of parameters on the geography of Reconstruction. So as I end in the book, I sort of want to push west, and I really want to sort of think about what's happening in the West and what is the relationship between Native Americans. And not just because I need to sort of populate the omnibus of the oppressed. Let's look at the dispossessed people in the 19th century. But I actually think because it can tell us something really important about federal power and the expansion of federal power at this critical watershed moment.
Well, yeah, and it's great. I wish there would have been more at the end, obviously, on that transition to the West. Everybody always wishes that there's more to a book, I'm sure.
Right.
And I'm sure partly you were ready to move on from it by the whatever umpteenth iteration of looking at it.
Right.
But do you have a new project right now?
Yeah, I have a couple that I'm working on right now. I'm really fascinated by the cholera epidemic of 1866. That was an international epidemic that began in India. It spread to Europe. It moved across the Atlantic into Cuba, and then it eventually made its way into seaports in the Carolinas, in Charleston, and in Louisiana. It moves up the Atlantic seaboard, and eventually it moves west. It is one of the biggest epidemics of the 19th century. Charles Rosenberg and others have sort of talked about it, but in terms of epidemiology, I'm sort of more interested in the ways in which public health guidelines developed a template for diplomatic and foreign relations in the 19th century, that nations that we thought weren't really engaging each other in any kind of fruitful or important ways were in the arena of public health, and they were very aware of what was happening. The United States and Russia, for example, their relationship typically only gets defined or narrated as a sort of late 19th, early 20th century phenomena that comes to, of course, a crescendo with the rise of the Cold War. But in my own research, I'm already finding there's a deep diplomatic relationship that extends beyond the industrial relationship or intellectual relationship that Americans and Russians had. So I think that it could become another way of thinking. Public health there can become another way of thinking about how to imagine the various templates that developed in response to foreign relations.
And finally, Jim, we have a lot of teachers as our viewers and our readers, and I was wondering, obviously you're tackling the war, emancipation from a very different angle.
Right.
How do you, when you step into the classroom, think about teaching the war to your students?
That's such a great question. I really have to spend a lot of time demystifying the sort of war is a great thing, war is a triumphant moment. I think that Drew Faust wrote a great essay many years ago called Why We Should Grow Too Fond of It, where it was a quotation, I'm not cribbing it correctly, but she pulled it from Robert E. Lee, and it's all about what's at stake in studying war and what we think about when we study war. And in my own work, I do take certain jabs at what it means to be a military reenactor, to study just the military history, because these battlefields are not just populated by the dead bodies of soldiers, they're populated by the dead bodies of freed slaves. So if we're going to reenact those wars, those battles, we need to think about that. And once you do that, then you don't get this sort of national mythology that so many people want. I do think that military historians have done a wonderful job, for example, at Camp Nelson, in sort of resurrecting the lost and dead bodies of freed slaves. But that's one of the major things I do. The other point, I think that the war gets more interesting before the battles start and once the battles end. That's my own interpretation. And so I try to teach the Civil War. I teach a whole class in the Civil War, and I begin in the 1820s, the 1830s, and I don't end until the 1890s with David Blight's book on memory. But a book that I use for teachers that I think would be great, I just think it's one of the best books on the Civil War, is it's an unexpected book. It's a book by Martha Hodes, and it's called The Sea Captain's Wife. And it's sort of framed as a story of interracial romance, and it is. And Martha Hodes is a wonderful storyteller, and she's a beautiful writer, and so you get this. But what you really get in that book, which is really useful for teaching, is that you get the build-up to the war. You get the ways in which the 19th century, the early part of the 19th century, sort of suffered from, at least in the North, from the sort of the dislocation of the market, from the market revolution. And you see how these people are living in poverty and are dislocated by poverty. And then, the famous phrase, which is often, mythology, is the Civil War is what? It's a war of brother against brother. Hoods actually shows how war brother against brother. I mean, there's a story about one of the brothers has to move to Alabama, and he's fighting on the wrong side. His enemy is his brother-in-law. I might have gotten that a little bit wrong, but it is his brother-in-law. Anyway, the point is, it's a wonderful, wonderful book. It tells the story of the Civil War, plus it tells this really juicy interracial story, this juicy story about a romance, an interracial love affair. So I think that.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for joining us. Again, the book is Sick from Freedom. It's already out. It is a wonderful, wonderful read, getting a lot of good press, a lot of conversation. People are talking about it, and it's really going to give you another view on the war and emancipation. So thanks again, Jim, for joining us.
Thanks a lot for having me.